Red lights filled the command deck before I even opened my eyes. I was Commander Elena Voss, and the alarm did not sound like a drill. It never sounded like a drill anymore. Not since the day we learned the galaxy was watching us, the way a wolf watches a lamb that has wandered too far from the herd. "Multiple signatures dropping out of fold space," said Daniel Kessler, my tactical officer, his voice tight but controlled. "Bearing 310, distance 400,000 kilometers, and closing." I was already moving before he finished the sentence. My boots hit the deck plating of the UES Meridian, humanity's newest flagship, and the corridor lights shifted from soft white to combat amber around me. Officers pressed themselves against the walls to let me pass, their faces pale, their eyes asking a question none of them wanted to say out loud. Is this the day? I reached the bridge in under a minute. The main view screen was already alive, with a slow, grim bloom of red icons, dozens of them, then hundreds, spreading across the tactical display like a stain no one could wipe away. "Report," I said, sliding into the command chair. "Fleet size estimated at 240 vessels," Daniel said. "Configuration matches Calith Dominion war doctrine. Heavy cruisers, troop carriers, and at least a dozen capital-class dreadnoughts." The bridge went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone is doing the same math at the same time and getting the same frightening answer. I had heard of the Calith Dominion before. Every officer above the rank of lieutenant had. They were one of the older powers out among the stars, a species that had conquered 11 worlds not through diplomacy, but through overwhelming force applied quickly and without warning. They did not send scouts, they did not send envoys, they sent fleets, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already finished. They had made one mistake this time. They had chosen Earth. "Ma'am," said Priya Malhotra, our communications officer, her hands steady on her console despite everything. "I am picking up a transmission. It is addressed to Planetary Command. I believe it is meant for all of Earth to hear." "Play it," I said. The voice that filled the bridge was cold, layered with a strange harmonic undertone that made my skin crawl, though I could not have explained why. It spoke our language fluently, which told me they had studied us for a long time before arriving. "People of the third planet, your world has been designated for annexation under Dominion Expansion Protocol. Resistance has been calculated as inefficient. Surrender your defense grid within 1 hour, and your population will be permitted to serve. Refuse, and you will be removed." The transmission ended. Nobody on the bridge said a word. I felt something rise in my chest that was not quite anger and not quite fear. It was older than both of those things. It was the feeling of a species that had spent 40 years quietly preparing for exactly this moment, ever since a scouting vessel from a lesser power had tested our defenses decades ago and nearly wiped out 3 of our coastal cities before we drove it off with nothing more than early rail cannons and desperate courage. That day had changed everything. That day, humanity had stopped arguing about borders and flags and had started building something else entirely. A shared purpose, a single, unified defense grid that spanned every continent and every orbital platform above them. A quiet promise that we made to ourselves in the aftermath of nearly losing everything. Never again would we be caught unprepared. "Ma'am," Daniel said quietly, "orders?" I looked at the red wall of enemy ships filling our screen, each one representing thousands of soldiers who believed, with complete confidence, that they were about to erase a world of primitives who barely understood how to leave their own solar system. They had no idea what waited for them. "Bring the grid online," I said. "Full activation, every layer." Marcus Whitfield, our systems officer, turned to me with wide eyes. "Full activation includes the deep assets, Commander, the ones we have never used in live combat." "I am aware of what it includes, Lieutenant." He hesitated only a second before his hands moved across his console. Across the surface of the Earth, in silos buried under mountains and oceans, in stations hidden along the far side of our moon, in orbital platforms disguised as harmless communication satellites, systems that had been dormant for years began to wake up. I had helped design parts of that grid myself, back when I was younger, and the memory of that first attack was still raw enough to keep me awake at night. I remembered standing in underground laboratories with engineers who had once built smartphones and electric cars, watching them turn their minds instead toward something far more serious. Adaptive artificial intelligence that could learn an enemy's tactics in real time. Swarms of small, self-directing drones that could overwhelm any single target through sheer coordinated numbers. Energy shielding reverse-engineered from wreckage we recovered after that first attack, then improved upon with human stubbornness until it surpassed anything the original builders had achieved. We did not tell the rest of the galaxy about any of it. We let them believe what they wanted to believe. We let them call us primitive. We let them underestimate us. Because every single time a more advanced power looked down on a smaller one, that smaller power eventually found a way to survive. We intended to be more than survivors. "Commander," Priya said, "the Dominion fleet is holding position. I think they are waiting for our surrender." "Let them wait," I said. On the screen, the enemy formation looked almost lazy in its confidence, spread out in wide, sweeping crescents that assumed no real resistance was coming. I understood that confidence. I had read enough recovered Dominion records, translated over years of careful study, to know that no species they had encountered before us had ever mounted a real defense. Every other world had folded within the first hour, exactly as threatened in that cold transmission. They expected the same from us. "All defense platforms report full power," Marcus said. "Grid integrity at 100%, swarm clusters awake and awaiting authorization." I stood from my chair and walked closer to the view screen, staring at that wall of red icons representing ships that had, without knowing it, sailed straight into the most heavily defended solar system in this entire region of the galaxy. Somewhere behind me, Daniel spoke again, quieter this time. "Ma'am, they are broadcasting again, repeating the surrender demand. Their patience window is closing in 5 minutes." I thought about my grandmother, who had lived through the first attack and spent the rest of her life terrified of a bright light in the sky. I thought about every child born after that day who grew up practicing shelter drills alongside fire drills, who had never known a version of Earth that was not quietly, constantly preparing for exactly this moment. I thought about the fact that we had one chance to show the galaxy, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what kind of mistake had just been made. "Belay that," I said. "We are not responding with words." Nobody on the bridge asked what I meant. They already knew, because we had trained for this exact scenario more times than I could count. Every drill, every simulation, every long night spent adjusting the grid's response algorithms had been building toward this single moment. "Daniel," I said, "status on interception windows." "All windows green, Commander. Full grid saturation achievable the instant we receive authorization." I looked one more time at that wall of enemy ships, arrogant and unaware, sitting in orbit around a planet they believed was defenseless. "Authorize it," I said. "All of it. Right now." The bridge crew moved with a calm precision that would have looked, to any outside observer, almost peaceful. There was no shouting. There was no panic. Just quiet hands on quiet consoles, executing a plan that had been rehearsed 1,000 times before this single moment finally arrived. Far above the surface of the Earth, hidden platforms began to open. Silent, patient, and utterly ready, humanity's true defense finally revealed itself to a galaxy that had never bothered to look closely enough to notice it was there. The Dominion fleet had 1 hour to wait for our surrender. They were not going to get it. Instead, they were about to receive the only answer we had ever intended to give an invading force, bold enough to threaten our home. And somewhere out among the stars, in every corner of the galaxy where our name was spoken with contempt, that answer was about to change the way an entire civilization thought about the small, quiet, blue planet they had underestimated for far too long. I sat back down in my chair, folded my hands, and watched the numbers on the screen begin to shift. "Grid is live," Marcus said. "All systems synchronized." "Enemy fleet still holding position," Daniel added. No change in their formation. They still believe we are considering surrender. I allowed myself a small, tired breath before I gave the final order. Let them keep believing that, I said, for a few more seconds. The bridge fell into that particular silence that comes right before something enormous happens, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your own heartbeat sound too loud. Every screen glowed steady and ready. Every officer sat with their hands hovering above controls they had trained on for years, without ever once expecting to use them for real. Outside the hull of the Meridian, in the vast dark spaces between our world and the fleet that had come to conquer it, the true shape of humanity's defenses waited in silence, patient as stone, ready to answer a threat the galaxy had never imagined we were capable of meeting. I glanced at the mission clock ticking down in the corner of the display. 3 minutes remained before the Dominion's deadline expired. We were not going to need them. The countdown on my screen read 2 minutes and 40 seconds when the first Dominion cruiser shifted position, a small, almost lazy adjustment that told me their sensors had finally noticed something was different about our world. I watched the icon move and felt my pulse quicken, though my voice stayed level when I spoke. "Daniel, talk to me. What are they seeing?" "Their scans are picking up power fluctuations across the orbital band," he said, eyes fixed on his display. "I do not think they understand what they are looking at yet. Their database still classifies our technology as pre-interstellar." That was exactly what we wanted them to think, right up until the moment it stopped being true. Around the curve of the Earth, hidden platforms continued their silent awakening. I had walked through the construction bays of some of those platforms years earlier, back when they were nothing more than skeletal frames and half-finished wiring, built by engineers who used to design passenger aircraft and now spent their nights designing something meant to never be seen by the public at all. We told our own people very little about the true scale of what we had built. Fear does strange things to a population, and we had learned, through hard experience, that quiet confidence held a society together far better than loud reassurance ever could. "Enemy troop carriers are adjusting formation," Priya said. "I believe they are preparing to deploy landing craft ahead of the surrender deadline. They may be trying to establish a ground presence before we can respond." That detail told me everything I needed to know about how little respect this fleet held for us. They were not simply threatening an attack. They were already positioning themselves to occupy our world, confident that nothing waiting below could possibly interfere with their plans. "Let them try," I said quietly. Marcus turned from his console, his face lit by the pale glow of the tactical display. "Grid response protocols are fully synchronized, Commander. The moment you give the order, every asset moves together. There will be no delay between systems." I nodded, though my attention stayed fixed on the view screen, on that slow, arrogant drift of alien ships settling into position above a planet they believed was already theirs. I thought back to the years spent building this moment, piece by piece, mind by mind. I remembered sitting in a briefing room with General Victor Okafor, the man who had first proposed the unified grid concept back when most of Earth's governments still argued more with each other than with any outside threat. He had stood in front of a room full of skeptical officials and said something I never forgot. "The next time they come, they will not send a single ship to test us. They will send everything because they believe we cannot possibly be a threat. Our only advantage is that they will be wrong, and they will not know it until it is far too late to matter." He had been right about almost everything, except for one detail. He believed it would take another century before the next fleet arrived. Instead, it had taken less than 40 years, and I found myself standing in the exact position he had once described so clearly, watching an enemy fleet make the same fatal assumption every other power in the galaxy had made about us. 1 minute to their surrender deadline, Daniel said. Understood. I watched the Dominion formation continue its slow, confident spread, dreadnoughts positioning themselves at the center of the fleet, while smaller cruisers fanned outward to cover a wider approach. It was a textbook conquest formation, designed for an enemy with no real defensive capability. It was, in other words, designed for exactly the kind of target the Dominion believed Earth to be. "Commander," Priya said, her voice tightening, "I am picking up a secondary transmission, internal Dominion communication, not meant for us. Our translation systems are still working through it, but I believe they are discussing ground deployment timelines. They fully expect zero resistance." I felt something settle in my chest, cold and steady, the particular calm that comes right before an inevitable moment finally arrives. "Let it stay that way for a little longer," I said. Behind the pale curve of our atmosphere, humanity's answer continued to gather itself in silence. Somewhere along the far side of the moon, a platform the size of a small city finished its final power cycle and settled into readiness. Along the equator, buried defense stations that most of Earth's population did not even know existed completed their own synchronization sequence, each one linking into a shared intelligence network that had spent years learning, adapting, and preparing for exactly this scenario. I remembered visiting one of those stations during its early construction, walking through corridors lined with engineers from a dozen different nations, all of them working toward a single, unspoken understanding. This was not about any one country protecting its own borders. This was about a species protecting its only home, together, without the old divisions that had once made us so vulnerable in the first place. 30 seconds to deadline, Daniel said. I stood from my chair again, unable to remain seated through the final stretch of waiting. My hands were steady, though my heart pounded harder than I wanted to admit, even to myself. "Grid remains fully synchronized," Marcus confirmed. "Awaiting your order, Commander." On the screen, the Dominion fleet continued its slow, confident drift, utterly unaware that every ship in their formation now sat inside a kill radius built from decades of quiet human determination. They believed they were watching a helpless world consider its own surrender. In truth, they were sailing directly into the most carefully constructed trap ever built by a species desperate never to be caught unprepared again. 15 seconds, Daniel said. I thought briefly of every person who had worked toward this moment without ever expecting to see it themselves. Engineers who spent their careers designing weapons they hoped would never need to be used. Officials who argued for decades about funding a defense grid against a threat most of the public refused to believe was real. Families who lived their entire lives in the shadow of that first attack, teaching their children to be ready for a day that might never come. That day had arrived. 10 seconds, Daniel said, his voice steady, despite the tension radiating through the bridge. I raised my hand, palm open, and every officer around me understood exactly what that gesture meant. We had rehearsed this moment more times than any of us could count, not because we expected to enjoy it, but because we understood, with complete clarity, what would happen to our world if we failed to execute it perfectly. 5 seconds. Outside the hull of the Meridian, the void of space remained calm and silent, giving no hint of the storm about to erupt within it. The Dominion fleet held its arrogant formation, confident, patient, and utterly unaware of what waited hidden around them. 3, 2, 1. I closed my hand into a fist. "Execute," I said. The word left my mouth quietly, almost gently, though its weight settled over the bridge like something enormous and unstoppable finally being released after years of careful restraint. Marcus's hands moved across his console in a single, fluid motion. Daniel's eyes locked onto the tactical display, already tracking the response he knew was coming. Priya sat perfectly still, watching the moment unfold with the same disbelief every one of us felt, despite years of preparation. Across the orbital band surrounding Earth, hidden platforms that had waited in silence for decades finally opened themselves to the stars. Along the far side of the moon, a station the size of a small city unleashed the full weight of its dormant power. Buried defense installations along the equator activated in perfect unison, their combined intelligence network processing the Dominion formation with a speed and precision no organic mind could ever match. For one brief, suspended heartbeat, nothing appeared to happen at all. The Dominion fleet continued its slow, confident drift, still utterly unaware that the trap around them had already closed. Then the sky itself seemed to change. I watched from the relative safety of the Meridian's bridge as our full defensive response finally revealed itself to a galaxy that had spent so long assuming Earth was nothing more than an easy target. It began as a shimmer along the edges of our orbital platforms, faint at first, then brightening rapidly into something that no longer looked faint at all. "Grid discharge initiated," Marcus said, his voice tight with focus. "All platforms reporting successful activation. Enemy fleet showing sudden defensive maneuvers," Daniel added. "They have finally noticed us, Commander. It is far too late for it to matter." I stood at the center of the bridge, watching the beginning of something I had spent half my life preparing for, and felt neither triumph nor satisfaction, only a steady, focused resolve. The Dominion fleet had come, expecting an easy conquest. Instead, they were about to discover exactly what happened when a species spent decades quietly refusing to ever be caught unprepared again. The moment the grid discharged, the entire tactical display in front of me changed so quickly that my mind struggled to process what my eyes were actually seeing. Lines of light raced outward from every hidden platform surrounding our world, converging on the Dominion formation with a speed that made a mockery of everything their sensors had told them about human capability. "Direct hits across the enemy front line," Daniel said, his voice rising with something between disbelief and focus. "Their forward cruisers are losing shield integrity within seconds of first contact." I watched red icons on the screen begin flickering, then vanishing entirely, each one representing a warship the Dominion had believed was more than capable of overwhelming anything our world could offer in return. I felt no satisfaction in the moment, only a grim, focused clarity that came from years of preparing for exactly this outcome. "Their formation is breaking," Priya said. "Internal communications have shifted from deployment orders to distress signals. They are trying to understand what is happening to them." They would never fully understand it, not in the short amount of time they had left to try. Our defense grid was not a single weapon. It was an entire network of coordinated systems working together with a precision no traditional military hierarchy could ever match. Swarm clusters of small, self-guided drones descended on individual targets with relentless focus, adapting their attack patterns in real time based on each ship's specific weaknesses. Energy platforms cycled through rapid discharge sequences faster than any organic crew could track, let alone counter. And above it all, an adaptive intelligence network studied every enemy movement as it happened, adjusting our response with a speed that made the entire battle feel less like a fight and more like a demonstration. "Their dreadnoughts are attempting to return fire," Daniel said. "Targeting solutions are inconsistent. I do not think their systems can process our attack patterns quickly enough to respond effectively." That was, in many ways, the entire point of everything we had built. The Dominion's war doctrine had been refined over centuries of fighting enemies who fought back the way they expected enemies to fight, with predictable formations and traditional tactics. We had spent decades studying exactly that kind of predictability and building something specifically designed to break it apart. On the screen, one of the Dominion's massive dreadnoughts attempted a slow, defensive turn, its shields flaring brightly as it absorbed the first wave of our swarm assault. For a moment, it almost looked like it might hold. Then a second wave struck from an entirely different angle, followed immediately by a third, each one adjusting instantly based on data gathered from the failure of the last. The dreadnought's shields collapsed within seconds, and the ship itself went dark on our display, drifting silently amid the wreckage of the ships around it. "Multiple capital ships down," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was reporting. "Enemy formation cohesion at less than 40% and falling rapidly." I stared at the view screen, watching a fleet that had crossed unimaginable distances with total confidence in their own superiority, now scattering into chaos in a matter of moments. Somewhere among those ships, soldiers who had expected an easy conquest were instead experiencing something none of their training had prepared them for, a defeat so swift and so complete that it likely felt, to them, almost impossible to believe. "Their command vessel is broadcasting again," Priya said. "I believe this is an attempt to re-establish contact." "Let me hear it," I said. The voice that came through this time sounded nothing like the cold, confident tone from before. It was strained, rushed, and unmistakably desperate. "Unknown Defense Network. This is Dominion Flagship Ethereal. We are requesting immediate cessation of hostilities. Our forces are prepared to withdraw from this system." I felt the weight of that request settle over the bridge, but I did not answer it immediately. My eyes moved across the tactical display, watching our grid continue its methodical, relentless work against a fleet that had given us no such courtesy only minutes earlier. "Continue the response," I said quietly. "Do not stand down until the threat is fully neutralized." I understood, even as I gave the order, that some might question the decision later, but I also understood something else, something that every officer on that bridge had learned through years of studying the history of encounters between larger and smaller powers across the galaxy. Mercy shown too early, before a threat was truly finished, had a long and painful history of being repaid with betrayal. "Enemy troop carriers attempting retreat," Daniel said. "Several vessels are breaking away from the main formation. Allow safe passage for any ship that powers down its weapons systems and holds position for boarding," I said. "Continue full response against any vessel that does not comply." It was not mercy born from weakness. It was mercy offered on our terms, after we had already demonstrated, beyond any possible doubt, exactly what continued resistance would cost them. Across the tactical display, I watched as more and more Dominion ships began powering down, their weapons systems going dark one after another, as their crews finally accepted the reality of what had happened to their fleet. The ones who refused to comply continued to face the full, unrelenting focus of our defense grid, their numbers dwindling with every passing second. "Enemy fleet strength now below 15% of original force," Marcus reported. "Remaining vessels are either powering down or attempting emergency fold jumps." "Do we have the capability to stop the jumps?" I asked. "We do, Commander, but I would recommend against it," Daniel said carefully. "Allowing a small number of survivors to escape may serve us better in the long term. They will carry word of what happened here back to Dominion Command and to anyone else listening." I considered his suggestion for only a moment before nodding. He was right. There was value in restraint, especially now, in the earliest moments of a victory that would soon ripple far beyond the edges of our own solar system. "Let the survivors go," I said. "Continue standard protocol for any hostile vessel that does not power down." The battle, if it could even be called that anymore, continued for only a few more minutes before the last defiant pockets of resistance either surrendered or were removed from our tactical display entirely. What had begun as an invasion force of over 200 warships, confident in their overwhelming superiority, had been reduced to a scattering of powerless hulks and a handful of fleeing vessels desperate to escape a fight they never should have started. "Grid stand down initiated," Marcus said, his voice quiet, with something that sounded almost like disbelief, even though he had helped design the very systems that made this outcome possible. "All platforms returning to standby readiness." I remained standing at the center of the bridge, staring at a tactical display that now looked almost peaceful compared to the chaos of only minutes earlier. Debris drifted silently where warships had once held their arrogant, confident formation. A handful of escape pods blinked weakly among the wreckage, awaiting recovery. The remaining Dominion vessels sat powerless and adrift, their crews likely still struggling to understand exactly what had just happened to them. "Casualty and recovery teams standing by," Priya said. "Do we begin recovery operations, Commander?" I took a slow breath before answering, feeling the enormity of the moment finally settle over me now that the immediate danger had passed. "Begin recovery," I said. "Treat any survivors according to full humanitarian protocol. I want no exceptions made, regardless of what they did or believed before today." Around the bridge, my crew moved with the same quiet precision they had shown throughout the entire encounter, though I could see, in the way their shoulders finally relaxed, just how much tension had been carried through every second of that fight. None of us celebrated, none of us cheered. We simply returned to our work, because we understood, even in that moment of overwhelming victory, that the true consequences of what had just happened were only beginning to unfold. Somewhere among the survivors drifting in the wreckage of their own fleet, word of this battle was already forming into a message that would soon travel far beyond the edges of our solar system, carried by frightened soldiers eager to explain to their superiors exactly why an entire invasion force had failed to conquer a world they had once dismissed as hopelessly primitive. I stood quietly on the bridge of the meridian, watching the last embers of battle fade into stillness, and understood, with complete clarity, that nothing about humanity's place among the stars would ever be the same again. The hours after the battle felt strange in a way I had never expected. There was no celebration on the bridge of the meridian, no cheering, no relief expressed out loud. Instead, there was a quiet, focused exhaustion as my crew moved through the careful, methodical work of recovery, documentation, and assessment. I had imagined this moment countless times over the years, and never once had I pictured it feeling this heavy. Recovery teams have secured 43 survivors from the Dominion fleet, Priya reported, her voice tired but steady. Medical staff are treating injuries now. Most appear to be in shock rather than physically harmed. I nodded, watching the feeds coming in from our recovery shuttles as they carefully approached drifting escape pods and powerless enemy vessels. It struck me, watching those images, just how young some of the Dominion soldiers looked once their armor and confidence had been stripped away by defeat. They did not look like conquerors anymore. They looked like frightened young people who had been sent into a fight their leadership assured them would be easy, only to discover exactly how wrong that assurance had been. "Commander," Daniel said, "one of the surviving officers has requested to speak with someone in command. She says her name is Vesa Thren, formerly serving as second officer aboard the flagship Ethrel." I considered the request for a moment before nodding. "Bring her to a secure briefing room. I will speak with her myself." The Dominion officer who sat across from me an hour later looked nothing like the arrogant voice that had delivered our surrender ultimatum earlier that day. Her posture was tense, her eyes wary, though she made a visible effort to maintain some sense of composure despite everything she had just experienced. "You erased an entire invasion fleet in under 2 minutes, she said, her translated voice flat with something that sounded almost like disbelief. "Our intelligence reports classified your world as pre-interstellar. How is this possible?" I studied her for a long moment before answering, choosing my words carefully. "Your intelligence reports were outdated. My world learned, a long time ago, what happens to civilizations that assume weakness in others simply because that weakness is convenient to believe." She was quiet for a while after that, her eyes drifting toward the small viewport in the corner of the room, where the faint glow of Earth's orbital defenses could still be seen against the darkness of space. "Your leadership," she finally said, "will not be pleased to learn of this outcome." "I imagine not," I said. "But that outcome was decided the moment your fleet chose invasion instead of conversation. We did not seek this conflict. We simply refused to lose it." She did not respond to that immediately, and I found myself feeling an unexpected flicker of sympathy for her, despite everything her fleet had intended to do to my world only hours earlier. She was, in many ways, just another soldier caught in the machinery of a system built on the assumption that overwhelming force would always be enough to guarantee victory. Over the following days, as recovery operations continued and the surviving Dominion soldiers were treated with careful humanitarian protocol, word of the battle began spreading far beyond our own solar system. I sat in briefing after briefing with General Okafor and other members of Earth's Unified Command, reviewing intercepted communications between Dominion Command and various other galactic powers who had, until recently, viewed our world with the same casual contempt the Dominion once had. The Dominion is attempting to minimize the scale of their defeat in their internal reports, Marcus said during one of those briefings, projecting a translated communication onto the room's central display. They are describing it as an unexpected technological anomaly rather than a coordinated defense. "That will not last," General Okafor said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had spent decades preparing for this exact moment. Survivors talk. Officers write reports that eventually reach rivals and enemies of the Dominion. The truth of what happened here will spread, whether they wish it to or not. He was right. Within a week, our long-range monitoring stations began picking up a surge of activity across communication channels we had spent years quietly observing. Other galactic powers, some of whom had never bothered to acknowledge Earth's existence at all, were suddenly discussing us with a level of interest that felt, in its own way, almost more unsettling than the invasion itself had been. "We are receiving formal contact requests," Priya reported during another briefing, scrolling through a growing list of messages arriving from species we had only ever encountered through second-hand intelligence reports. Several factions are requesting diplomatic engagement. Others appear to be attempting to gather more information about our capabilities before deciding how to proceed. I sat quietly through much of that briefing, watching the scale of what we had set into motion continue to grow with each passing hour. This was no longer simply about surviving a single attack. This was about an entire galaxy recalculating exactly what kind of neighbor humanity had turned out to be. That evening, I found myself standing alone in one of the Meridian's observation decks, watching the slow, silent drift of Earth far below, its surface calm and unaware of just how close it had come to catastrophe only days earlier. Most of our civilian population still did not know the full scale of what had happened above their heads. They had been told, through carefully worded public statements, that an attempted incursion had been successfully repelled by planetary defenses. The deeper truth, the decades of quiet preparation, the true extent of the technology we had built, remained something known only to those of us who had lived it directly. I thought about that choice often in the days that followed, wondering whether it was the right one. I understood the reasoning behind it. Revealing the full scope of our capabilities too quickly risked provoking exactly the kind of galactic panic we had spent so long trying to avoid. But standing there, looking down at a planet full of people who had no idea how close they had come to losing everything, I felt the weight of that secrecy more heavily than I expected to. "You look like someone carrying more than your uniform allows for," said a familiar voice behind me. I turned to find Daniel standing in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, offering one toward me with a tired but genuine smile. "I keep thinking about what happens next," I admitted, taking the cup gratefully. "We won this fight, but I do not think this is the end of anything. I think it might only be the beginning." Daniel nodded slowly, joining me at the viewport, his eyes settling on the same quiet blue world drifting below us. "Maybe that is true," he said, "but we are not the same world we were before that first attack all those years ago. We learned something that day, and we have spent every year since then making sure we would never forget it." I thought about his words for a long moment, watching the gentle curve of Earth's atmosphere catch the distant light of a sun that had no idea how much had just changed for the small, stubborn species living beneath it. "What do you think happens now?" I asked quietly. He considered the question carefully before answering. "I think other powers will start paying attention to us in ways they never did before. Some of them will be curious, some of them will be cautious, and I imagine a few of them will be afraid, which may end up being the most dangerous reaction of all." His words settled over me with a quiet, uncomfortable weight, because I knew, even as he spoke them, that he was almost certainly right. Fear had a long, complicated history among the powers of this galaxy, one that could just as easily lead to cautious respect as it could to desperate, preemptive aggression from those who felt suddenly threatened by our existence. Over the following weeks, as diplomatic messages continued arriving from across known space, Earth's unified command found itself facing an entirely new kind of challenge, one that had nothing to do with military strategy at all. We had spent decades preparing to defend our world from physical attack. We had spent far less time preparing for the delicate, complicated work of stepping onto a much larger stage, one filled with ancient civilizations, complex alliances, and rivalries that stretched back far longer than the entirety of human history. I remained in command of the Meridian throughout that period, watching from my position aboard Earth's flagship as our world slowly began the long, uncertain process of redefining its place among the stars. The Dominion invasion had ended in complete failure, its remaining fleet scattered, and its ambitions toward our world shattered beyond any hope of recovery. But in its place, an entirely new set of questions had emerged, questions that would shape the next chapter of humanity's story in ways none of us could yet fully predict. We had proven, beyond any doubt, that Earth was no longer an easy target for anyone bold enough to test us. What remained to be seen was exactly what kind of neighbor the rest of the galaxy would decide we had become. 3 months after the battle, I stood in a briefing room deep beneath the surface of Earth, watching a live feed of a vessel unlike anything I had seen approach our world since the day the Dominion fleet arrived. This one, however, came without weapons raised, without demands, and without the cold arrogance that had defined every previous encounter our species had experienced with the wider galaxy. "Confirmed identification," Priya said from her station beside me. "The vessel belongs to the Halvith Concord. Their transmission requests a formal diplomatic meeting with Earth's unified command." I glanced toward General Okafor, who stood at the head of the table with his arms folded, studying the approaching ship with the same careful patience he brought to every decision he made. "The Halvith Concord," he said slowly. "One of the older alliances in this region. They have never once reached out to a species as young as ours before." "What changed?" Daniel asked from across the table. "What do you think changed?" Okafor replied, a faint, tired smile crossing his face. "We stopped being invisible." The weeks following our victory against the Dominion fleet had unfolded exactly the way Daniel predicted that quiet evening aboard the Meridian. Word of the battle spread far beyond anything we could have contained, carried by frightened Dominion survivors, intercepted communications, and the simple, undeniable fact that an entire invasion force had ceased to exist in a matter of minutes. Every power that had once dismissed Earth as an irrelevant, primitive world now found themselves forced to reconsider exactly what kind of neighbor they were dealing with. Some of those powers responded with curiosity. Diplomatic envoys began arriving with increasing frequency, each one careful and measured, clearly uncertain how to approach a species that had, seemingly overnight, revealed capabilities far beyond anything their intelligence reports had prepared them for. Others responded with caution, maintaining careful distance while quietly increasing their own defensive preparations, unwilling to repeat the same mistake the Dominion had made in underestimating us. A small number responded with something closer to fear, and it was that fear, more than anything else, that occupied most of my waking thoughts during those uncertain months. "The Halvith vessel is requesting permission to enter orbital range," Priya said. "Their message emphasizes peaceful intent and formal diplomatic protocol." I looked toward General Okafor, who nodded slowly. "Grant permission," he said, "but maintain full readiness across the grid regardless. Trust is something earned over time, not granted on the strength of a single polite request." I understood his caution completely. In the months since the battle, Earth's unified command had spent countless hours debating exactly how open we should be with a galaxy that had only just begun to take us seriously. Some officials argued strongly in favor of complete transparency, believing that open cooperation would earn us faster acceptance among the established powers of this region. Others, myself included, argued for a slower, more careful approach, one that allowed trust to develop naturally rather than being extended freely to civilizations we still knew very little about. The debate had grown even more complicated once representatives from smaller, less powerful species began reaching out as well, drawn by rumors of a young civilization bold enough to stand against the Dominion, a power many of them had lived in quiet fear of for generations. I remembered the first time I spoke directly with a representative from one such species, a small delegation from a world called Ithera, whose people had lost an entire colony to Dominion expansion decades earlier. "You did what none of the larger powers in this region were ever willing to do," their representative told me, speaking through a careful, measured translator during that early meeting. "You proved that the Dominion could be stopped. For many of us, that alone has changed everything about how we see the future." I remembered feeling the full weight of those words long after that meeting ended, understanding for the first time just how far the consequences of that single battle above our world had already begun to travel. We had not simply defended our own home. We had, without ever intending to, shifted the balance of power across an entire region of the galaxy, offering hope to species who had spent generations believing resistance against powers like the Dominion was simply impossible. That realization brought with it an entirely new kind of responsibility, one none of us had fully prepared for during all those decades spent quietly building our defenses. It was one thing to protect our own world from invasion. It was something else entirely to suddenly find ourselves viewed as a potential ally, a symbol of resistance, or in some cases, a dangerous unknown that needed to be carefully managed before it grew too powerful to control. "The Halveth vessel has entered stable orbit," Marcus reported, pulling my attention back to the present moment. "Their envoy is requesting to begin the meeting whenever we are ready." I straightened my uniform and glanced toward General Okafor, who offered a small, encouraging nod. Together, we made our way toward the secure meeting chamber where humanity's first formal diplomatic exchange with an established galactic power was about to begin. The Halveth envoy who greeted us appeared calm and composed, her posture radiating the kind of careful diplomacy that came from centuries of practiced negotiation between established powers. She introduced herself simply as Nath, a senior representative of the Concord's outer diplomatic division, and her first words carried a tone of genuine curiosity rather than the cautious suspicion I had half expected. "Your victory against the Dominion has drawn considerable attention across this region," she said, once formal introductions concluded. "Many wish to understand exactly what kind of civilization managed to accomplish something so many others believed impossible. We simply refuse to accept the outcome they assumed was guaranteed," I said carefully. "We spent a long time preparing for a threat we hoped would never come. When it finally arrived, we were ready." Nath studied me for a long moment before speaking again. "The Concord has observed civilizations rise and fall many times throughout our long history. Very few manage to defend themselves so completely against a power as established as the Dominion. Fewer still manage to do so while extending mercy to survivors, as your forces did following the battle." I remembered that detail clearly: the choice to allow surrendering Dominion vessels safe passage, the decision to treat captured soldiers with careful humanitarian protocol despite everything they had intended to do to our world. It had not been an easy decision to make in the heat of that battle, but standing here now, watching the reaction it had produced across the wider galaxy, I understood just how important that choice had truly been. We believe strength without restraint eventually becomes indistinguishable from the very threats it claims to oppose, General Okafor said. "We intend to be remembered as a civilization capable of both." Nath's expression shifted slightly at those words, something that might have been genuine respect crossing her otherwise composed features. "That is a rare philosophy among younger civilizations," she said. "The Concord would welcome the opportunity to establish formal diplomatic ties with your world, should you be willing to consider it." The negotiations that followed stretched across several more meetings, each one carefully building toward a framework of mutual respect and cautious cooperation between Earth and the Halveth Concord. It was neither a formal alliance nor a simple trade agreement, but something more careful and deliberate, an acknowledgement that our two civilizations might have much to offer one another, provided that relationship developed with patience rather than haste. In the months that followed, similar conversations began unfolding with other powers across the region, each one approaching us with their own particular blend of curiosity, caution, and calculated self-interest. Earth's unified command found itself navigating an entirely new kind of challenge, one that required patience, careful diplomacy, and a constant, unwavering commitment to the values we had spent so long building our defenses to protect in the first place. I remained aboard the Meridian throughout much of that period, watching from my position on Earth's flagship as our world slowly transformed from an isolated, hidden civilization into something far more complicated and far more consequential. We were no longer simply defending our home from threats beyond the stars. We were beginning, carefully and deliberately, to define exactly what role we intended to play among the many civilizations sharing this vast and complicated galaxy. One evening, several months after that first meeting with the Halvith envoy, I found myself once again standing in the Meridian's observation deck, watching the familiar blue curve of Earth drifting peacefully below us. Daniel joined me there, just as he had on so many quiet evenings before, offering a cup of coffee and settling comfortably beside me at the viewport. "It is strange," I said quietly, watching the gentle rotation of clouds across the planet's surface, "to think that a few months ago, none of this existed. No diplomatic meetings, no careful negotiations, just a fleet of enemy ships and the quiet certainty that we might not survive the day." "And now," Daniel said, following my gaze toward the world below, "we are being asked to help decide what kind of future this entire region of the galaxy is going to have." I considered his words carefully, feeling the full weight of everything that had changed since that first, terrifying moment when the Dominion fleet dropped out of fold space above our world. We had spent decades preparing quietly for exactly this kind of confrontation, never imagining that survival alone would lead us towards something so much larger and so much more complicated than simple defense. "Do you think we are ready for what comes next?" I asked. Daniel considered the question for a long moment before answering, his eyes never leaving the slow, steady rotation of our world below. "I think we have spent so long preparing to survive that we sometimes forgot to imagine what might come after survival," he said. "But I also think this is exactly the kind of challenge humanity has always found a way to rise toward, even when the odds seemed impossible." I thought about everything that had happened since that first quiet alarm on the bridge of the Meridian, the battle that unfolded in mere seconds, the careful, deliberate mercy extended to defeated survivors, the slow, uncertain process of stepping onto a much larger stage filled with ancient powers and complicated histories none of us fully understood yet. It had been, in every sense, only the beginning of something far larger than any single battle could ever fully capture. "We erased an entire invasion fleet in seconds," I said quietly, almost to myself. "But I think the real work is only just beginning." Daniel offered a small, tired smile, raising his cup slightly in a quiet, unspoken toast toward the world drifting peacefully below us. "Then we had better be ready," he said, "because I do not think this galaxy is finished testing us yet." I looked out at Earth one final time that evening, watching the soft, familiar glow of our world against the vast darkness surrounding it, and felt, for the first time since the battle ended, a quiet, steady sense of hope rather than fear. We had proven, beyond any doubt, that our world was no longer an easy target for anyone bold enough to threaten it. What remained now was the far more difficult task of proving exactly what kind of civilization we intended to become, not simply in moments of desperate defense, but in the long, uncertain years still waiting for us among the stars. And somewhere far beyond the edges of our small, quiet solar system, word of that promise was already beginning to spread, carried across a galaxy that had underestimated us once, and would not make that same mistake again.